Coming up on the heels of the Brooklyn Nets parting ways with Steve Nash, first a couple, then maybe only one name emerged as the future head coach for the Brooklyn Nets. Familiar face Ime Udoka, likely to become the next Brooklyn Nets head coach. We break down the ramifications and impact on this roster next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. You're going to find Doug Norrie over there. You're going to find Adam Armbrecht over here. We're going to thank you for making us your first listen of the day, where we are free on all those great platforms, and let you know that today's episode is going to be brought to you by Bet Online. Bet Online has you covered all season long with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Bet Online, where the game starts. And Doug, where we start, is doubling, nay, tripling down on our coverage of the Brooklyn Nets and the impending potential coaching hire here over the last, starting at on Tuesday at about 10 to 1 East Coast time, 12:50 p.m. Start to come in from Adrian Wojnarowski with a couple of bombs. Steve Nash has parted ways. Follows it up with, there are a short list, including Ime Udoka and Quinn Snyder on the list of candidates to replace him. And then in conjunction with Shams Charania, all but confirms, it feels like, that the hiring of Ime Udoka is imminent for the Brooklyn Nets, bringing him back into the fold as the head coach.
Yeah, I mean, we're rolling back to back on the podcast here with just news coming in fast and furious. And, we said on the previous podcast, and this is probably borne out to be true, is that it was going to feel very weird for the Nets to have made this move in firing Nash without a pretty clear idea and path forward for who they wanted to bring in, right? And so it would have just the state of where the Nets are right now, where they are in the season, where they are in their, superstar hierarchy, where they are in their championship contention, dreams, all this other stuff, and just where they are, with their record. Firing with a huge high profile firing of Steve Nash, or mutually parting ways, however you want to say it, would have felt actually like malpractice if they hadn't had a plan set up, right? Yeah. Like, because they're just at too precarious of a situation. They just don't. They're at a real inflection point as an organization right now with how the rest of the season and maybe just the future of the team is going to go. And so it's not surprising to me at all that now it's a little surprising about Ime, but it's not surprising that they had a move ready to fire here. No. Because I just don't know how you get rid of Nash, or how Nash leaves, unless you're totally ready to answer the next question, because then otherwise it becomes even more of a circus. And it's already has high circus potential here, just with everything that's going on.
It already is.
What's
it's a 2-ring circus. Why not make it 3? Like, why stop short?
So, from a basketball perspective, this is hard. There's no holes to poke in this. Like, this is a great hire for the Nets. And there's other stuff around Ime that maybe is going to have to be answered for, or is going to come up in the next few days. But in general, I'm not shocked at all that the Nets were prepared to make the next move was ready to fall very, very quickly after the Nash release, just because I don't see how it could have played out any other way.
No. And to your point, you're going to let go of Nash and then turn around and say, and Jacques Vaughn will be the interim head coach for the remainder of the season. Now, the only other option that this could have gone would have been, we're firing Steve Nash. And as we discussed previously, and we're also going to be trading Kyrie Irving. We're also trading Kevin Durant, and we're blowing this whole thing up down to the studs. That would have been the only way that you could walk into this abyss with having a sense of ambiguity and just saying, yeah, maybe Jacques Vaughn, maybe somebody else on the staff. It really, at this point, doesn't matter, because we don't have any agenda for the remainder of the season. Instead, what looks like is being heavily suggested through reports, and ultimately, as you mentioned previously as well, when it comes from both sides of Shams and Woj, you start to feel like everything is coalescing to be factual in the very near future. Then, that being the case, what does Ime Udoka mean as the head coach of this basketball team? I mean, let's just start at the high level. Do you have any concern of the volatility of bringing Ime Udoka off of the issues that he had in Boston, which you'll obviously outline here in a second, And then also on the heels of what has been going on with Kyrie Irving for the Brooklyn Nets in the last week plus.
Yeah. So we can start with Ime, right? So for those aren't aware of the timeline, he was put on a 1-year suspension by the Boston Celtics before the season began because of, I'm just going to read this right from Woj. An independent law firm probe into Celtics coach Ime Udoka found that he used crude language in his dialogue with a female subordinate prior to the start of an improper workplace relationship with the woman, an element that significantly factored into the severity of his 1-year suspension, sources told ESPN. So he was put on a 1-year suspension by the Celtics, and it was unclear about what the future held for him. Would have been shocking to me, kind of in some ways, to have him brought back after such a it's a totally unprecedented move. Not saying it's not warranted or anything. I'm just saying it never happens to suspend the coach for a season, and then that alone doesn't happen. It's usually just you're fired, right?
And that was a lot of what was speculated at the time was, if you're suspending him from a year, why aren't you just outright firing him?
Right. So I don't know if it's because of just, the contract, or he was going to sue, or what. Who knows? That's all speculative. I have no idea. But it was just such a weird situation. So then when you get the Nash piece that's reported, and Ime's name is instantly attached to it, right? Like within 2 separate tweets was
pause question here. Was Snyder's name included, as we always associate Woj as being connected to organizations and tightly connected to the Brooklyn Nets? Do you think that Snyder's name was added into that so that it did not come across as, we are only talking to Ime Udoka, he is going to be the head coach, and frankly, this has been in the works for a long time? No, we have multiple candidates we are considering.
I mean, it happened pretty darn quick. So this is one of those, free agency starts at noon, 12:01. This guy signed. I was like, that is the fastest negotiation we've ever seen in the history of the world. Really, and it happens every single year, like clockwork. You can set your watch to it, where the guys are signed a second. So have these conversations been happening? Yes. Were more names floated out to give the appearance of a coaching search? I guess. I don't know. It feels like, why waste the characters in the tweet, because it happened so quickly. But, information comes the way it's going to come. But what we did know at the time, what we suspected strongly, was those names weren't pulled out of thin air, and that there was probably a very real possibility. With Ime Udoka, obviously, there's ties to the Nets organization here. It was on the staff. It was thought that the timing, for him going and becoming a head coach with the Celtics was when Nash was still the coach, right? So it would have meant, letting Nash go to have Ime become the head coach. I don't think anyone realistically thought that was going to happen at the time. Remember, let's not do revisionist history here. The Ime Udoka was a highly sought after coaching candidate, but his stock rose meteorically when he made the finals last year with Boston.
Yes.
Within basketball circles, it was known that he was a very high quality hire. Him taking the Celtics team sort of to a surprise finals appearance is what puts his name onto the national, everyone knows who he is now. So I just want to be clear that to not have people sort of rewrite timelines wholeheartedly here because of what's come out since Udoka went to the Celtics. The situation was moderately different at the time, right?
Yeah, no,
so,
very fair,
but judging by where these organizations are now, it does feel like, no pun intended, like the perfect marriage, because of where these guys are and where the team is and what everyone sort of needs as maybe a mini reclamation project for everybody, right? Everyone needs to sort of reclaim a little bit of the narrative here and just reclaim some of the basketball stuff. And from that point, if you go back and listen to our last YouTube, you heard us kind of go through the candidates, and Ime ended up becoming the only one that even made sense because of just where
everything.
Yeah, because if you just factor in everyone else's motivations, coaches, front office, and players, the list actually kind of did become only one person long.
This isn't taking over as president and CEO of Apple after Steve Jobs passes away, right? It was this is not this is taking over, Burger King, as they're wondering whether or not the flame broil is really the way to go for their burgers. This is not the most attractive job. And as we mentioned previously too, there is a high opportunity that you could actually end up damaging your coaching resume by taking this role over the remainder of this season. So depending on where you are in your career, could certainly be a difficult hit. I do want to, here coming up in a second, ask you specific questions around what Ime accomplished in Boston last year and what it could mean for this Brooklyn Nets team.
All right, before we get to that, going to tell you about our friends over at betonline.net, your number one source for all your betting needs, basketball, football on Sundays, on Saturdays too with college football. BetOnline's got everything you could ever hope for, latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth analysis on every single game. BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sports wagering info, live betting too, if you want to go get into that, up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. I mentioned basketball and football. We got MLB, MMA, boxing, golf. It's all there. Head on over to BetOnline. And through your mobile device, you can learn about all the different trends, all the different action. BetOnline, where the game starts.
All right, so where I'd like to start here, after reading the private text message where you lambasted yourself for saying Joe Johnson on a previous episode as fictitious person, but it gave me a good chuckle a little bit behind the times. When it comes to what this will mean, Ime Udoka as the head coach. Now, the Boston Celtics were already a strong team on both ends of the floor prior to him coming in. However, he did turn them to another corner here, getting to the NBA Finals last season. The one prominent question I want to ask is 104.5 points per game, league best last year defensively for Boston, held opponents to 43.4 field goal percentage, best in the league, 33.9 from beyond the arc, best in the league, and a top 10 in terms of foul trips to the line by the opposition at just over 20. Do the Brooklyn Nets have the personnel on this roster to start to make that mold? They don't have Time Lord. They don't have, Gerald Williams. They don't have certain guys that, they don't have a Marcus Smart. However, they do.
Gerald Williams. You mean Grant Williams? I know.
Gerald,
all right, we both made mistakes.
That's an ex-Yankee from the 90s.
That undoes my Joe Johnson reference before.
Probably.
So now we're even on the ledger.
Grant Williams, do you think that the Nets roster as constituted right now has the ability under Ime's influence to start to get back to that core value that we frankly thought coming into the season? The defensive end of the floor is where the Nets should be able to have some success and trigger their offense. We haven't seen it play itself out yet. How do you feel about that end of the court and what he brings with the roster the Nets have?
Okay, so the Nets don't need to be 2022 Boston Celtics on defense to be good, right? No. So that's the first thing. The Celtics, in a lot of ways, they outkick their, personnel coverage by being just good enough on offense and amazing on defense. The Nets already know, I think we know, can have the bones here to have a great offense and just need to be kind of adequate on defense, and they can be a winning team, right? They don't need to have a top. I mean, to win the championship, they probably have to get close to a top 10 defense because that's just usually how it goes. Yep. But they can have a top 5 or better offense if things break right. So they don't have to build this thing exactly like there was built the Celtics. I actually, in a lot of ways, think that Udoka took the personnel he had and made the best version of it, right? And the best coaches, again, he did it once. I don't know if this is something he can do at every stop, right? But
a lot of stock getting put into this 1 year pot for Ime.
And again, this is why it was the perfect time to buy an Ime here, because there was, if we talked about this, I'm going to get a little confused about where we said what here because we've done a lot of talking today. But we did say for Udoka that in terms of basketball resume right now, he comes in with as strong a basketball resume as you can get in terms of in the players and eyes and front office eyes. He's coming off an awesome job and as a super fiery guy. And he already just backed it up. He took a team and just backed it up, took them to the finals, took a team that no one thought at the trade deadline was going to had any chance going to the finals. And they went to the finals. So good luck. At least right now, saying that he can't, that you don't agree with something he wants to do, because right now that resume looks pretty polished from a basketball perspective. Now, when it comes to taking your players, the hope here is that with a guy like him, and I strongly believe that this will be the case, is that you take the personnel you have and you mold that into the best version of the team that it can become with the best systems. Yep. Do they have the personnel to have the same level of defense that they had last year? Definitely not. Definitely not. They do not have Robert Williams is a top 5 defender when he's healthy. Marcus Smart won the defensive player of the year. Shouldn't have, but still did, right? He was still
good enough to
great defender, right? And then you have Horford, great defender. Grant Williams, great defender, right? Jaylen Brown, great defender, right? So they had a different group of guys. But the Nets have offensive pieces that are significantly better than any of those players. So the hope is that you take the personnel you have, you mold that into the best group that you can play with. And that's just what the best coaches do. If Ime is going to be the new coach, then we're about to find out if that's possible. But I believe it's you'd be hard pressed, at least from, it's always hard to tell what coaching impact guys have, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that's the hardest thing. It's very easy. It's sometimes maybe you want to say it's all wins and losses. Well, it can't be that, because Nash had won 30 more games than he lost. So it can't just be the wins and losses. And so it would appear, though, that at least in the one season sample size, Udoka was able to get much more out of a group of players than the expectation. And usually that is actually just that usually ends up becoming the barometer for coaching success, is what the expectation was and then where you landed, right?
Well, good news is the expectations for the Brooklyn Nets is to win a championship. So all he has to do is
it's funny about that now, because I don't know, it is, but they're also 2-5. So in some ways, you could say the expectations are low. Like, this is what makes this situation very weird, is that I agree with you. The expectation on a high level should be the championship. You're also inheriting a 2-5 team that looks like it's had a massive amount of problems at like the offensive end and at times, the defensive end and at times the offensive end. And so in some ways, there's nothing to go but up. So he could be walking into a sort of perfect situation, narratively speaking, as well. I don't know. It's a really funny. This is like such a fascinating time for the team.
Oh, God, it's been a fascinating, what feels like 30 years, but it's only been a few. Coming up here in a second, we'll take a look just at the offensive side of the ball, and then I want to suggest a couple of interesting things from a personnel standpoint and roster, because we know there were a lot of moves made here, obviously underneath Sean Marks, but what does that mean underneath potentially Ime Udoka as the next head coach of the Brooklyn Nets? Okay, so just to round it out too, remember last year, the Boston Celtics were essentially a top 12-ish offensive team, and those numbers are a little bit off based on when he actually made the big switch for them. They were one of the best teams on both ends of the court effectively over the last third of the season, and then going into the playoffs and on the run that they did. But it's also worth mentioning that the Brooklyn Nets last year were a top 10 team in scoring. They were a top, I think, 4. They were 4th overall in field goal percentage, right? Like, even in what has been a tumultuous run here for the Nets. And they were also 10th overall in three-point shooting from beyond the arc in a season where they didn't have Joe Harris at all. And Seth Curry even missed a little bit of time too, right? And now Patty Mills did go nuclear as best he could for as long as he could. The point being is that for everything that whatever was not done correctly from a head coaching standpoint, or from a player standpoint, or from an off the court standpoint, walking in the door, the bones of this team is, in theory, we're right there, ready to be a top 10 offensive team with consistency and climbing up those ranks. We've already seen glimpses of it this season. The question, to your point, it's almost like flipping the script. Boston last year, top defensive team and doing it right on the offensive end. Now I think you reverse that hierarchy and say you need to be one of the most potent offensive teams and be good enough, consistently enough on the defensive end. What I do wonder is, when we look at this roster, where are the immediate changes that we think we see as you get Ime in here and you think about just rotation pieces, players that you want to see more of? Oddly enough, I'll be a little bit curious around guys that were brought in this offseason, like a Markieff Morris. Like, and this isn't just about because a lot of the personnel was already in place for him in Boston as well, but they use some of their veteran guys incredibly effectively. Right? Al Horford is 63 years old and still playing at a very high level. I wonder how that changes a little bit. And I wonder if some of the younger players, maybe only specifically a Cam Thomas, I'm not saying I want or need it, but we've talked about Patty Mills and his struggles. How does Ime look at Edmund Sumner and even Seth Curry and Cam Thomas and some of these other fringe role players and say, what's the best version of my rotation? And that's going to take a little bit of time here too. Like we thought it was going to take time coming into this season with Steve Nash at the helm. Well, now Ime has to come in knowing what? 40% of the roster probably still the same from when he was with the Nets. The other 60% is going to be new for him. And he's going to have to figure out how to use that personnel.
Yeah, I mean, all those players are question marks here. Like, I think you'll see a probably more dialed in roster to begin with, or rotations to begin with. We joked that this season felt a little helter-skelter with the rotations, even when they were all healthy or not. It felt like guys were sort of playing out of nowhere, and then they would disappear just as quickly. And so I would be shocked if that continued to happen, right? As things got dialed.
The first thing you do is tighten it up.
Honestly, and we said this last episode, and we'll say this forever now, probably till the end of the season. It just starts and stops with Simmons at this point. I think we know what we're getting from Kyrie and KD at both ends of the court. They both looked Kyrie especially has looked dialed in on defense this year, and we know what they've been doing in terms of scoring. I think Durant obviously was a fan of Udoka before he left. And so I don't think there's any question marks there. I just think it's what can he get out of Simmons? Like, is he a motivator for Simmons? Is it like that's something that's going to work? He's a fiery dude. He's an emotional guy. He has a ton of confidence. He's backed it up to a certain degree. This is a very different coach than Simmons will have had in his career. Simmons' coaches were Brett Brown, who wasn't not really like this. Doc Rivers, we saw how that ended. And now Steve Nash. Like, I think for Simmons, this will be a very different kind of coach. I know you mentioned a lot of other guys, and I'm not trying to like just sidestep those dudes.
No.
Like,
it's fine to be because we knew it coming in, and it's always going to be what happens with Ben Simmons. Let me ask you. Well, I don't want to make this. It's like I'm interviewing you. I think that Ime will come in and he's going to squeeze Ben Simmons. He's going to squeeze and demand. It's going to be either you make it or you don't. Because I can't coddle you, right? I need you to be this. My only curiosity that I have is, will he say, listen, if the offensive game isn't there yet for you, so be it. I need you to be an elite. I need you to be defensive player of the year. You start there, knock it off fouling out of games. You need to be able to lock dudes up with consistency. You need to be doing every little detail. I need you to be getting double-digit defensive rebounds. If you do that for me, I'll sort out the rest offensively when you're on the court, as opposed to saying, we got to get this guy up to speed offensively. Listen, I got enough offensive firepower. Maybe my best function is to say, do what you do best. I'll sort out the other component of this. And you can still be demanding of Ben Simmons, but demanding of him in the thing that he can do at an incredibly elite level.
Yeah, you got to be able to play defense with him as a coach. Like, I think he's been a defensive coach from the beginning. Like, that's what he made his bones with as the Nets. I mean, the Nets, I was looking this up because someone asked this in chat, was what their ranking was when he was like the head of the defense. They still ranked 20th that season in defensive efficiency. It wasn't like they were amazing, but
small sample size, right?
But yeah, like but it's also, I mean, he took that team last year and made them like almost historically good on defense. So it's and he had the right personnel. I don't think we'll see the same exact scheme being run, because I don't think the Nets just have that group of players. Again, they don't need it. Like their offense, the potential offensive firepower, is significantly higher than what the Celtics had, who were making do with just very wing heavy Jason Tatum led offense. And that's just not how the Nets need to really operate here. It's also interesting to note that along with Steve Nash, the staff was not fired here, right? Like, as far as we know, Jacque Vaughn appears to be retained. Igor is still on the staff. I mean, unless I'm missing something, I'm saying this at 2:45 Eastern. I have not seen that the staff was let go, the Nash's staff. So who ends up, sticking with this group is probably going to tell a little bit also if the Udoka piece is finalized. I'm not exactly sure, but I don't want there to be confusion around they're not going to look like the Celtics. They can't, but it's okay. It's okay. They don't need to look like the Celtics to be a really, really great team. But I think these first few weeks will be fascinating to watch. And I will say, from a Nets fan perspective, and I think I'm going to speak for the fans in this case, I think Udoka has an incredibly long leash also. I think this is an interesting sort of just factor to think about in terms of, who you bring in, because of what he, behavior aside of why he was released or suspended, and what ultimately it's going to be like now effectively released as Celtics head coach. Again, it's like, I think even in the fans' perspective, they'll have a lot of leeway in terms of what happens, because there's going to be a belief that with him, it doesn't need to happen right away. Because think about what happened with the Celtics last year. It did not happen right away for this team. This team was really floundering for the first half of the season. They were actually underperforming expectation, to a point where Celtics folks were starting to write them off because they just weren't very good. And then a switch got flipped in the second half of the season, and they just looked amazing. And so even with that, it's like Udoka has so many other narratives built into him as a hire that help this team too. You don't have to be good right away. Unlike Nash, whose time had run out, the hourglass had dripped all of its sand down to the bottom. No one could hear anything that was like, hey, give it time. Because with him, it was like all the time has been given, right? Like Udoka, I think you actually bought yourself I think you bought yourself more time in some way.
Well, here's what I'll say too. And I agree with you on Steve Nash, and I agree with Ime having plenty of time. If assuming that he is hired as the Brooklyn Nets head coach, he'll have plenty of time to sort this out and get it on track. However, I do think that there will still be, not on him, but on the team overall, and specifically Kyrie Irving. That is like, I don't think that the team that plays this year and maybe has success is going to be the team that goes forward for the Brooklyn Nets. I still think like the old 3-ring circus that is the Brooklyn Nets is going to keep having some tent poles up well through this season and into next offseason. But what Ime accomplishes, and maybe with in totality of personnel, is going to impact how the Brooklyn Nets organizationally look at it. What I think the Nets will accomplish here in hiring Ime is doing what they thought they should have, maybe they missed a chance on. Hiring a head coach that they think can be the head coach long-term, right? That it can be a part of it for the Kevin Durant era with Kyrie Irving, without Kyrie Irving, trying to win championships, and then beyond Kevin Durant retiring and feeling like you have a true coach that can take talent and elevate it and get the most out of it. Like, that's what I think is the reason why the Brooklyn Nets would jump back into these waters, given what's gone on with Ime in this past offseason and the Boston Celtics.
And they're clearly prepared to take whatever the short-term PR hit is going to be here, because again, there's some weird questions to answer. The guy was suspended for an entire year by an organization. I'm not trying to bury this lead at all. Like, this is a very real thing. Like, they're coming off of a controversial thing with one of their players, the Nets. And they're coming off a summer of discontent among the superstars. But it's almost like it's so funny. It's almost like so many things have gone wrong for this team that at this point you're like, yeah, why the hell not? Right? Why not just try it? Why not just bring this guy in? Yeah. Like, it can't get any worse PR wise for this team. So it's not like this is going to move the needle any closer to the bottom. Like, they've already been there for a long time with just around how, like, what's happened. And so I'm not saying this is an excuse to, like, sidestep poor behavior or misjudgments. And like, this is not me okaying any of that. I'm really not. If anything, like, you have to answer all the questions here. This might be uncomfortable for times. Like, people should ask hard questions around, like, what's happened, like what kind of behavior gets you suspended for an entire season after you just did a really good job. Right. Yeah. Like,
and why don't the Brooklyn Nets care about what got?
But I'm saying, and I'm saying they just this might be the bargain that they've had to make with themselves, is that, like, it's gone really bad. Marks' job has to be on the line here, 100%. Like, if this was Sean Marks' last season, the GM, I wouldn't be shocked. Like, this is because at some point you don't have any more moves to make. Like, you hired the coach, it didn't work. You traded for the players, it didn't work. Like, at some point, the buck has to stop somewhere. You can't just keep putting Band-Aids over things. And so if you're Marks and you're desperate and you maybe do see the writing on the wall that, like, this is it for me, because there's no more excuses. If I hire 2 bad coaches, right, or 3, sorry, because he's had multiple coaches on the resume now, and I'm the one who got all these players, and I'm the one that did all this. At some point when it doesn't work, it's on you. And it doesn't seem like his job has been unsafe here. It didn't seem like Nash's job was relatively unsafe 24 hours ago, even though it was trending that way. You have to believe that this move by Marks is him making maybe one last salvo and saying, it's worth it to answer the questions around Udoka, because I'm just not going to have a job in a year. Well, and that's just where they are.
And it's interesting too, because we'll close this out here. We'll stay for just a few minutes extra on the live here, and then we're going to get out the door. But it's interesting to think about, as we always say, you can't fire the players. We understand that. If you're going to get rid of any of the high profile players, it was going to be tearing it down to the studs. In some ways, as you mentioned it, if we're kind of at the bottom of the barrel here in terms of PR, maybe we take the extra leap forward of what could have been a decision we would have made in the offseason to bring back Ime. Instead, we'll take the hit now. We understand it's going to be ugly, but we want to give the second chance opportunity to him, and we're going to do it ahead of schedule, which is going to look a little bit ugly. The other thing is, obviously, as we know, maybe you had a coach all those years ago in Kenny Atkinson, but when you bring in superstars, you start to make moves and you make the devil's bargain. The other big benefit for Sean Marks, I think, is that he went out and made moves this offseason that so far, early days, Royce O'Neal, Yuta Watanabe, like, these are players that look like they're definitely more hits than misses, as he's had going back to last season, right? A lot of misses with the players he tried to bring in. So this could be the right combination of having brought in good personnel in the offseason. You're riding it out with your superstars, and you get a hot coaching candidate on the court, even with everything that he brings off the court as well. So we'll continue to cover this. We'll also cover what happens with Kyrie Irving and what happens with Ime Udoka in terms of the off the court discussions that are inevitably going to come here. In the meantime, though, this is the Brooklyn Nets trying any which way but loose to make this thing successful. They refuse. The Titanic is sinking. and they are demanding that they bail this water out and get this thing back afloat.
Look, it's been anything but uninteresting over the last couple of years. It hasn't all been good, but it's definitely. I just got a tweet, and it was from one of the guys from Locked On. It was like the Nets have had. It's not like the Nets guys have had anything to talk about for the last couple of months. It's like never ended.
Yeah,
it's like
there are jealous members of the Locked On family.
Oh, for sure, because when it comes to stuff to talk about, it's like interesting is better than nothing, right? So and this has been the case here with the Nets for a long time. Really appreciative that everyone that jumped in. We've been on at this for almost 2 hours here on YouTube, so you can go back and check out our previous episode, which is all about the news that Nash had been released and let go. And then we obviously picked up with this one with the Udoka news. I'm sure there will be something else that will happen here in the next 5 minutes that will warrant another podcast, because that's just the way it rolls. Really thankful for everyone that jumped into YouTube. Make sure you subscribe over onto YouTube, where we're going live with all this stuff. Sometimes the podcast takes a few hours till it actually goes up live. YouTube's happening right away and live almost all the time. So that's why it's just worth it to be subscribed over on YouTube. Make sure you hit subscribe to Locked On Nets.
And we will be wrapping this one up here. No bonus session, mostly because I think Doug and I might just need to drink some tea, a little bit of honey in there. Who knows for sure. It's been a busy day, but we will be back in covering all of these things. And as we say, to everything, turn, turn, turn. There is a season. Turn, turn, turn. A time and a purpose under it all. Why, that is, I don't know, whoever sings that song. Peter Seeger.
The Carpenters?
Yeah, Peter Seeger and the Carpenters. Yeah.
Well, one of the all-time great poets, presumably. It's been a long day. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.